My name is Mary Burman, and I'm currently Dean of the Faye W. Whitney School of Nursing, and I've been in this position since 2007. And how did I get here? That's a good question. I didn't know that I would be an academic, to be honest with you. Way back when, though, I grew up in Laramie. My father said to me, you should go somewhere else to school. And he was a professor here at UW, and thinking along the lines that if you want to come back to UW, you should get your degrees somewhere else. Now, as a teenager, I thought that was the okay to move away from home and get as far away from home as possible. So I went out to be a nurse, went on to graduate school, and all of a sudden realized that actually academics was probably what I wanted to do after all, and my dad's advice had been very good. So I got my degrees in Minnesota and Michigan. And Marcia Dale, who was Dean of the School of Nursing before I was, several people ago, called me one afternoon and said, do you want to come back to Wyoming? And I said, absolutely. So I was hired at UW in 1992 as an assistant professor and worked here virtually all of my career as an academic. I've gone through sort of the typical chain that a faculty member goes from assistant professor up to full professor, and along the line taken on different sort of administrative positions. I headed up the nurse practitioner program for a long time before Anne Marie did, so the nurse practitioner program is near and dear to my heart, and thrilled to see it move to the DNP. I'm just really excited about it. I was actually the Associate Dean for the College of Health Sciences for quite a long time, and actually the acting Dean of the college at one point as well. But then came back to the School of Nursing and have been in this position since 2007. So that's sort of my path. It was one that I didn't set out thinking. I thought I was just going to be a nurse and provide care, but ended up being an academic and loving it in a lot of ways. You know, it's a variety of different things, and I think that's probably always the case. I think back about sort of key things that I have done. One of them was I got involved with a group. I was on the advisory board for the Albany County Public Health Department, and we were very concerned about the folks falling through the cracks, and so we got together a group from across the town, hospital, Interfaith Good Samaritan, all kinds of people. And out of that sort of a 2-year planning process, we developed what's now the Downtown Clinic, which is a clinic serving low-income, uninsured persons, and has been doing so since the early 1990s, which is pretty amazing. That was an amazing collaborative process, having to work with people from across the city with differing views about how we should go about doing things. And it gave me a respect about the power that collaboration can, I think, have. It also gave me a lot of skill in then figuring out how to do that, how to communicate, how to negotiate, how to compromise, how to keep moving towards a common goal and not get trapped back here because groups disagreed somewhat on some key point along the way. And probably that experience gave me some of the best leadership experience I've probably ever had. It's real work. We had a really clear goal of what we wanted to do and really brought in a variety of different people. It was probably one of the most exciting things I've ever worked on. And again, it's still in operation this about 14 years later. I also, on top of that, was involved, I was accepted into the Robert Wood Johnson Executive Nurse Fellowship Program in 2000, probably about 10. That's a 3-year program focusing on development of leaders who had backgrounds in education, practice, regulation, all kinds of things. It was an amazing group. I was in a cohort of 20 people. We spent 3 years together. We'd meet several times a year. We worked on projects. An incredible experience, and the contacts then across the country. And again, back on this idea of how do we work together towards a common goal, that experience gave me a lot of experience in that particular area. So those are two. There are others, but those are two probably key things that I can think about. I always give credit to my mother because she's just an amazing woman. She is one of those people that walks into a room and organizes people. I don't know how she does it, She's amazing. She'll walk into her room and there's a job to be done, and before you know it, she's got 6 people doing it and they're all having a great time, and then they come back the next time because it's been a great experience. And I've learned a huge amount. She's a completely natural and engaged leader, and you can learn a lot by watching folks like that. She never went to any sort of leadership institute or something like that. She came upon this completely naturally. She's a wonderful organizer. And I could go on in hilarious stories about how we went on vacation and her organization of the entire family. There were 6 kids, and probably you don't want all those details. So I always credit my mother, but there have been several other people who have also inspired me. And to be truthful with you, the person that's probably inspired me the most is someone I never knew. When I was in graduate school at Michigan, I used to get just sort of absolutely lost in the bowels of the Taubman Medical Library. It was a huge medical library, and I got really engaged in learning about a woman named Lillian Wald. She is considered to be really the founder of modern public health nursing, and she's a fascinating woman. And I never knew her. She died in the 1930s. But she's just remarkable. The legacy she left in terms of her writing is phenomenal. She grew up in Rochester, New York. She was inspired to become a nurse. She was from a fairly well-to-do family, but she was inspired to be a nurse, I believe, when her sister had a baby. She really was enthralled by the role that the nurse played when her sister had a child. So she went to nursing school. She was actually considering medical school, but the story that she relates that she's called to the home of a very poor family in a New York tenement. She's moved by this time from Rochester to New York City. And she's called to this home and is so appalled by the conditions that these poor, mostly immigrant folks were living in the New York tenements, that she drops out of medical school and dedicates her life to serving those in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And she moves to that part of New York City. She develops what was called the Henry Street Settlement. It's still in existence now. And eventually, as a part of that, came the New York Visiting Nurse Service, which is the largest home care agency in the country. So that's the legacy of her work. But there's other parts of it. She's an amazing woman. She could have lived a very comfortable life. Like I said, her family was, well, not super rich, but obviously very comfortable. She could have sort of said, oh, I'm sorry about these poor people, but, I'm going to go back to Rochester and live a nice life. But she didn't. She was very, I think, discontented by what she saw, particularly in this tenement home. And I think rather than sort of pushing that discontent away, she actually used that to motivate herself to do something about it. I mean, the story, she wrote a book later in life called The House on Henry Street, I think, if I remember the name of it. And she tells a lot of stories about what they did. And so again, instead of wanting to get rid of the discontentment, she makes it a core part of who she was, of we've got to do something about this. So she developed all these nurses to address the needs of those living in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. I think the other thing that she did, that she has that we can all learn from, is she had a deep, I think, respect for humanity. This is at a time, if you think about it, this is at the turn of the century, into about the probably 30s is when she was at the peak of her career. This was at a time of complicated race relations, and yet she spoke openly about needing to respect all persons regardless of their background, where they came from. Nursing at this time had an uneasy relationship. We were not really keen on that time. If you were an African American, you would have trouble getting into a nursing school. So there was a whole separate development of schools for African American students because many of the prominent schools would not accept them. Lillian Wald, again, sort of brushed up against this race relations in a very different way. She was actually involved in the development of the NAACP, for example. So she had this deep, I think, abiding respect for humanity, regardless of their race, gender, background. And I think that's probably important for all of us to think about. I think we forget some of that at times. So those are a couple things that she did. I think the other thing that totally I respect about Lillian Wald is that she she spent over 30 years living on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And I think in the modern world, we tend to bounce around a lot, and there's nothing wrong with that, I don't think. But I also have come to learn how important it is to stay committed to something. So when you look about her life work, one of the key reasons she was successful is that she spent 30 years in the Lower East Side of Manhattan working on this. If you sort of spend 2 years here and 4 years there, 6 years here, 2 years there, you're probably not going to have that same kind of impact. That really deep, rich impact she had was because she spent 30 years at the Henry Street Settlement addressing these ongoing problems. And I don't think we think about that as much in the modern world, because it's so easy to work here a few years, take another job, work somewhere else. And again, I'm not being critical of that, but I've come to realize how important it is to have that long-term commitment to whatever it is that drives us in life. And Lillian Wald is an incredible example of that. She just kept at it for 30 years, addressing the needs of these immigrant families. And I think the other thing that Lillian Wald did that I also have come to truly respect is that she had a very broad perspective. She saw the world very much through a public health, community health framework. So while she took care of individuals, and her nurses took care of individuals and their family, she had this very much community focus about the impact that working with individuals had on the community, and vice versa. The impact of working on a community had on the individuals involved. And I think that's also another place where we need to think about. So that's a bit of a long story, but Lillian Wald is truly my hero in healthcare. I've learned a lot from reading about her and reading about the work that she did over time, and wish so much that I could have met her at some point. I think she knew Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, she's one of those unbelievable women in the world. She dedicated her life to something and had amazing impact, I think, on individuals, families, and communities as well. I would go back to what I just talked about with Lillian Wald. I think really maintaining that vision of a deep regard for humanity, that long-term commitment to whatever it is, whether that's, and I'm thinking of you in your case, if that's the needs of those with mental illness, for example, identifying that passion and then staying committed to it. And whatever it is, devoting, like Lillian Wald did, 30 years to that kind of work. And then again, keeping that broad perspective in mind. As nurses, again, we tend to work with individuals, but it's imperative that we have that broader framework. I mean, we talk about this in terms of the social determinants of health, for example. That sort of gets at, I think, the way that Lillian Wald viewed the world. Again, we can't just focus on individuals. We've got to be able to step back and look at the context within which these, with whatever our passion is, within which the people we're working with live. So I think the messages that we can learn from someone like Lillian Wald can be very helpful to new leaders. And I've often talked about this with students. I think by looking at her life, we can learn a lot about how we can have the kind of impact that she had over